Welcome to Bio 112. In this video, we're going to review some of the key concepts in evolution. So we're going to start with a definition of evolution. In biology, we're talking about the change in allele frequencies of a population over time. And that being said, we need to think about what is a population. A population is a group of organisms of the same species found in the same area. Generally, these organisms can reproduce. There are some exceptions to that rule, considering some organisms only reproduce asexually. However, for now, we're going to think about a population as a group of organisms, the same species found in the same area, and they can reproduce together. Okay, we're going to delve into 5 main mechanisms of evolution. So these are things that cause those allele frequencies to change in our population over time. And we're going to talk about the mutations, non-random mating, genetic drift, gene flow, and natural selection. Our first one is mutations. You've learned in previous classes that mutations are a change in the DNA sequence. So some key facts about our mutations. Okay? In evolution, mutation is our ultimate or original source of genetic variation. This is where new alleles come from. Okay? For those mutations to be passed on into the next generation, they have to be in the gametes. So an example, if you have some mutations in your skin cells on your arm, okay, you might develop a skin cancer. But because that mutation is not in your gametes, it's not going to be passed on to your kids. Our third fact is that mutations are random. Okay, generally, mutations are caused by damage to the DNA from external sources, things like chemicals or radiation. Mutations can also be spontaneous, which are errors during the replication process. And so, as far as evolution goes, remember, mutations are random. Organisms are not trying to mutate their DNA and create new variations or new alleles. Okay? Most of our mutations are actually going to be deadly. So if the mutation happens in a gene, okay, that coding section of our DNA that creates proteins, it can lead to death, disorders, deformities. Okay? Many of our mutations are bad. They can also be neutral. So if a change happens in the non-coding region, the junk DNA, then it's not going to have an effect on the phenotype. So sometimes we call these mutations silent mutations. Rarely we will have a new mutation that is a source of variability. Okay, so this can again lead to our new alleles, which may eventually lead to a new adaptation. But these kinds of adaptations, these kind of mutations, are very rare overall. So let's look at an example of mutation changing allele frequencies. So remember, when we calculate allele frequencies, we're looking at part over whole. So we are going to divide how many copies of an allele there are by the total alleles in the population. So in this original population of fish, they are all green. They all have the genotype big G, big G. Our allele frequency of big G is 1 or 100%. In our next generation, a little mutant fish is born. Okay, this little guy is blue, and he has the genotype of little g, little g. Okay, if we count up all the other alleles, we see that the frequency of the big G is now 0.8, and the frequency of the little g is 0.2. So this mutation has introduced a new allele and caused a change in the allele frequency of the population. This is a case of microevolution. Our second mechanism is non-random mating. So 2 key ideas here. Okay, we can talk about sexual selection, where organisms are mating based on a particular trait, or inbreeding, where organisms that are closely related are breeding together. We're going to focus on sexual selection. Sexual selection is a type of selection where organisms are reproductively successful based on a particular trait. This can result in sexual dimorphisms. So this is when we have males and females of a species that look very different. Okay? And it often has to do with secondary sexual characteristics. There are two types of sexual selection. Intrasexual selection is between members of the same sex. Generally, this is a male competition. And so I have a few examples here. We see the hermit crabs. Okay, the hermit crab with the larger claw is actually going to raise that up and intimidate the other hermit crabs. And whichever one backs down or is scared away is the one that loses. So they don't actually physically fight, it's more of intimidation. Okay, and the one with the biggest claw, who is more intimidating, gets the right to reproduce with the female. We also do have physical encounters, so fighting in these elephants, boxing in the kangaroos, or fighting over territories where the females might be living. And all of that is intrasexual selection. Intersexual selection is usually based on female choice. The female has a particular trait that she's looking for. This could be the biggest, flashiest colors, the largest tail in a peacock, okay, the best dance, the best song. So females will choose a male based on that trait, and he is the one that gets to reproduce. So birds are notorious for intersexual selection. This is why we often see those flashy, colorful males with a dull, drab female. Our next type of evolution is genetic drift. Drift has to do with random changes to the allele frequencies. Okay, drift has a bigger effect with smaller populations, and we'll talk more about that in a second. Okay, genetic drift also often tends to reduce genetic variation, okay, especially in small populations. There's a good chance of losing alleles. So here's an example of genetic drift modeled with marbles. So we have our initial population, and they've taken orange and blue marbles that represent all the alleles in the population, and we have this 50-50 mix. Okay, we randomly pick out 10 of those marbles that get to reproduce. So those guys get to pass on their genes to the second generation. And because this was a random sample and there's sampling errors, we see that the allele frequency does change. Okay, we repeat that process. Generation 1 or generation 2, okay, this F1 population gets to reproduce, but only 10 of them. And we see that that changes the allele frequencies again. Okay. So genetic drift causes evolution to occur. There's this change in allele frequency, and it is random changes. And again, this is directly related to population size. So if we have a huge population, this is 10,000 penguins, okay, and there's this weird allele that causes some of them to be red. Okay, that allele is found at a 10% frequency in this huge population of 10,000 penguins. If something happens and half our penguins die off, okay, we see that the allele frequency of the red allele is going to decrease a little, okay, but it did not disappear. So if we look at an example with the same allele of red, okay, but our population is only 10 individuals this time, so one individual carries that red allele. We kill off 50% of our penguins. There's a pretty good chance that that red allele is going to get lost. Okay, it will die off with that red individual. So small populations have a larger effect seen because of genetic drift. We can look at this graphically. Okay, so these were populations of mice that were bred in the lab. Some of the populations were very small, n equals 10, and we see these very large fluctuations in the allele frequencies over time, eventually leading to this loss of genetic variation, and we call that fixation. In our large population, n equals 1,000, we see some shift and some change over time, okay, but these allele frequencies tend to fluctuate right around the original frequency. So there are two major effects that can increase the genetic drift. The first one is the founder effect. So founder effect happens when a few individuals are isolated from a larger population. So they leave and found a brand new population. The allele frequencies in the small founding population is different than those of the parent population. Okay, and therefore their offspring are going to have a different allele frequency in that population than the ones in the parent population as well. So an example, we have all these beetles on the mainland, and let's say that each one of these beetles actually represents 100 individuals. So 100 individuals leave the mainland and they travel and land on an island. They are founding a brand new population on this island. Okay, which beetles leave is random. So this is a random sample from our original population. Okay, on the island they start to reproduce, and now we have a bunch of new beetles, but they're all red. We've lost an allele compared to the mainland population. Okay, so founder effect, a small group leaves a bigger population, founds a new population, and we see changes in allele frequencies because of this. Okay, our other big effect is the bottleneck effect. So bottleneck effect happens when a large portion of our population, usually 50% or more, dies off suddenly and randomly. Okay, this results in a smaller population that has different allele frequencies than our original population, and as that group recovers and reproduces, we're going to see a change in the variability or the variations of the alleles over time. So here's an example. We have this pond full of frogs. There are 3 alleles, yellow, green, and brown. Okay, there's a drought that hits one summer. Most of the frogs die off. Okay, which ones die is random, and only a few survive to reproduce. So in the spring, we see rain, we see reproduction, but this population only has 2 alleles, the yellow and the green. Sorry, the yellow and the brown. So we have lost an allele. Okay, and our new population has very different allele frequencies than our original population. We see a lot of implications for bottlenecks and a lot of problems with bottlenecks in conservation. A classic example is the cheetah population. Cheetahs have undergone a severe bottleneck due to human interactions, and this has led to a major loss in genetic variability within cheetah populations. Okay, so quick summary of our genetic drift. This is more significant in our smaller populations. Genetic drift can cause allele frequencies to change randomly, and it can lead to loss of genetic variation in the populations, which we call fixation. Sometimes we see genetic drift causing harmful alleles to become fixed. All right, our 4th mechanism of evolution is gene flow. Gene flow, also known as migration, is when individuals move between 2 established populations, and when they move or migrate, they take their alleles with them, and then they pass those alleles on to the next generation. So gene flow tends to reduce variation between 2 populations over time. It makes them more similar. This is the only mechanism that keeps populations the same between each other, okay, keeps them similar, rather than making them different. So I like to use an art example. I have a 3-year-old and she's not very good at cleaning off her paintbrush. So if she starts with 2 pots of paint, a red one and a blue one, over time she's going to have paint migrating back and forth between these 2 pots, between these 2 populations. Okay, given enough time, instead of red and blue, she's going to have 2 pots of purple paint. Okay, this is what gene flow is doing to our gene pool in this in these 2 populations. It is mixing the alleles and making them more similar, okay, and preventing them from differentiating. All right, our last mechanism is natural selection. This one is all about differential reproductive success. Okay, natural selection results in adaptations, which are traits that help an organism to survive and reproduce in their particular environment. Okay, it's important to note evolution is not goal-oriented. Natural selection does not involve organisms wishing for a new trait or trying to create a new trait that helps them to survive better. So in this little cartoon, we see a beaver who wants his adaptation. Okay, he wants a chainsaw arm. Okay, and so we see that this happens. Now that's what I'm talking about. Okay, this is not how natural selection works. You don't get to make up your own adaptations. It works with variations already present in a population. Okay, we're not evolving towards perfection either. So again, we're working with variations already present, so we're not evolving upwards towards perfection. There are 3 requirements for natural selection to happen. There has to be variation in a population already. The second one is variations must be heritable. Okay, our third requirement is that those variations cause differential reproductive success. This just means that some individuals are going to have more babies than others. Okay, that leads us to this idea of fitness. Fitness is reproductive success. Okay, the more babies you have, the more fit you are. So fitness is the likelihood of an individual to contribute fertile offspring to the next generation. The more fit you are, the higher your reproductive success. So we can look at this example. We have this first little bird who has a low fitness, and when she reproduces, she has 2 babies. Okay, and her babies only have 2 grandbabies. So she has a low fitness. The bird on the right has a higher fitness. This bird has 4 babies, and each of her babies has 4 babies. Okay, so much higher fitness. So we can calculate the relative fitness based on that absolute fitness. Okay, so the absolute fitness is just how many individuals or offspring you produce in your lifetime. Okay, so back to our birds, the absolute fitness of bird number 1 is 2. The absolute fitness of the second bird is 4. Our relative fitness is a comparative number. This is the survival and reproductive rate of genotype relative to the maximum survival or reproductive rate of other genotypes in the population. Let me show you what I mean. Okay, so our relative fitness is calculated using the absolute fitness divided by the maximum fitness. So we're going to look at our different alleles. Okay, in this case we have these black cats. Some have blue eyes and some have green eyes. Those are our alleles. Okay, the blue-eyed individual has an absolute fitness of 3. The green eyes have absolute fitness of 2. So our maximum fitness in this population is 3. Okay, we're going to take our absolute fitness divided by that maximum, which will always be 3. Okay, for our blue-eyed cats, that means we have a 3 divided by maximum of 3. Her relative fitness is 1. Okay, for our green-eyed cats, we have an absolute fitness of 2, and we're going to divide that by the maximum of 3, so we get 2/3, okay, which is 0.67. Alright, let's look at another example of natural selection in action. Okay, in the Arctic we have these bunnies, and in this population there is genetic variation. Some of the bunnies are very fluffy, some of the bunnies are not so fluffy. This is a heritable trait, which means that not so fluffy bunnies have not so fluffy babies, and fluffy bunnies have fluffy babies. Okay, this is going to lead to differential reproductive success. Our not so fluffy bunnies only have a few babies. Okay, our really fluffy bunnies are going to have a lot of babies. And this likely boils down to energy usage. Okay, our not so fluffy bunnies are going to be using more energy to stay warm, which means they have less energy to make babies. The fluffy bunnies, their coat helps keep them warm, which means they're spending less energy to maintain their temperature. They're able to have more energy for reproduction. Okay, so we can calculate their fitness. So the absolute fitness of the not so fluffy bunnies is 2. And the absolute fitness of our fluffy bunnies is 12. So we count in this picture 4, 8, 12. Okay, to do the relative fitness, we're going to divide the absolute fitness of 2 divided by the maximum, which is 12. Okay, so that gives us 2 over 12. And our fluffy bunnies, okay, we have 12 absolute fitness divided by the maximum of 12 equals 1. All right, so this brings us to the idea of survival of the fittest. Okay, the first thing I want to address is fitness. We've already said that fitness has to do with reproductive success. So this is not how fit you are going to the gym and getting big and buff. Okay, we are talking about how many babies are you contributing to the next generation. Okay, when we talk about survival, we're not necessarily talking about an individual dying. Sometimes survival has to do with your traits. Okay, is your allele being passed on to the next generation? So the traits are surviving based on reproductive success. And so, did you die? We can look back. Those bunnies, okay, the not so fluffy bunnies, still survived. They even reproduced. They were just not as fit as the fluffy bunnies. They couldn't make as many babies. Okay, so survival of the fittest has to do with the traits surviving, and natural selection is all about reproductive success. Another main idea with this natural selection is that the value of your trait is relative to the environment. If we take that fluffy bunny and change the environment to a desert, I doubt this bunny is going to survive. Okay, that fluffiness is not going to be a valuable trait. It's going to cause the rabbit to overheat. Okay, and it's going to be spending a lot of time trying to cool down rather than making babies. So, differential reproductive success, these traits are not always about being the biggest and strongest. So, sometimes it is. Okay, for example, we could have a large beetle who gets more food. Because he has more food, he has more energy. Because he has more energy, he can make more babies. Okay, sometimes differential reproductive success is about being the strongest. So if you have a strong deer, he wins more fights. Because he wins more fights, he chases off the other males, and he gets to have more babies. Sometimes, though, it's not about being the biggest and strongest. Sometimes it can be about being the sneakiest or the one that blends in the best. So cryptic coloration, we could have a spotted salamander that hides well in the leaf litter compared to the non-spotted salamanders that stand out. Okay, so spotted salamanders blend in, therefore they live longer. When they live longer, it gives them more chances to reproduce every year. Okay, so overall, through their lifetime, that spotted salamander will have more babies than the plain salamander. All right, so always remember with natural selection, life is a game. Okay, the more babies you have, the more points you earn. Double points for grandkids. Okay, life's a game. Whoever has the most babies wins. Okay, and fitness always depends on your environment. If you change the environment, you change the value of your traits. All right, in this video, we talked about the mechanisms of evolution. Our next step is going to be talking a little more about phylogenetics and then a little history of life on Earth.